everyone for joining us today. As you can see on your screen, we have a number of people who've been engaged in this that are going to help us walk through some of the learning and elements of the report. We really appreciate you coming on. And hopefully our intent today is to have a really dynamic conversation, to be showing you kind of what we've learned, what the More Than Money report is telling us, and most importantly, have a real conversation with innovators, with specialists around what we've learned and where it's taking us. For us, our team, the study of this was really about building on the work of others and exploring how we at USAID could refine how we best partner. So for today's discussion, just to go over the agenda, first of all, I'm going to share a little bit very quickly about why we think this is important. We'll go over the report, key findings, we'll reflect. Luckily, we're here joined by an amazing innovator and technical assistance provider, and we're going to reflect a little bit about what their experience has been. We'll get to have your questions, and finally talk a little bit about what does this make us think about and where do we go next. So in essence, just so you know how to use the program to interact with us, first of all, at the very bottom of your screen, you should see chat. If you want to ask questions or make comments, please make sure that you chat to all panelists and attendees, not just some. As we go forward, you'll get polls that kind of pop up on your screen to get your feedback. So please actively engage with those, pick your answers, and submit. And most importantly, provide your feedback afterwards, because this is a mutual learning experience for all of us, and we really want to hear from you. And most importantly, there's no need to ask. You will absolutely have access to this presentation, to the webinar. You'll see the link in the slides, but the link will also be provided in the chat box. And also join us on Twitter at #MoreThanMoney. So to introduce myself, my name is Alexis Bernal. I am the Chief of Applied Innovation and Acceleration at USAID at our Global Development Lab. And I have one of the best jobs because I have the privilege of working with some amazing innovators and social entrepreneurs, one of which you'll meet today. And our goal is really to figure out how can we be helpful, ensuring that these innovators and entrepreneurs have as much impact as possible. I think on behalf of all of us engaged with this, I would share with you that we're still learning. This report is part of our learning, part of our own growth, and we hope to learn and build on what you know. Hopefully some people will find what we managed to come together with at this report really useful and build on that. But most of all, what we really want to recognize is that the joy of our job is being able to see these elements advance, have impact, and grow. But really the hard work is being done by our innovators, and we're so lucky to have them. We're so lucky to have the ones that joined us today. So in short, we hope that this is helpful to people. We hope you give us feedback that helps us become an even better partner in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, good, okay.
This is Caroline. I'm Caroline Ashley. I'm going to present the findings of the report. But first, I've got a question for you to get the polling going. I hope this is a really easy question. We would like you to look at these options and identify which one relates to the organisation that you belong to. You can tick more than one if you want. And I'll do a nice countdown. 5 more seconds to answer. 5, 4. Oh no, people are still replying. I'll give another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I hope you've answered. Okay, interesting. So the highest number are providing advisory support. We don't have anyone who's already used it, but some who are seeking it. And we have other organizations that are supporting those that provide and seek it. Thank you very much for that. So, this is the report that's been launched today. It's a study of research and analysis. The focus is current practices in acceleration and technical assistance services, and on those services that are provided to enterprise that focus on both development impact and commercial success. The report provides 3 things. It's a stock take of the landscape, who's doing what, where, why. It teases out some trends, because there are a lot of trends in this space, and it highlights lessons that have been learned on how to be effective. Those are the three main things it provides. You need to know also the three things it's based on. It's a review of literature. A lot of that literature is grey, it's fuzzy as well as grey. It's certainly not academic or rigorous. It's based on a review in more depth of 65 initiatives, mainly desk research, and interviews with 21 initiatives that provide advisory support. So there's a big caveat there that it's based more on the views of providers than on clients or recipients of advisory support. It was written jointly by Ashley Insight and Endeavour. I'm the director of Ashley Insight, as well as you might be aware, I'm the editor of the Practitioner Hub, who's hosting you today, jointly with Endeavour for USAID. Now, the report has 5 sections, but we've condensed it down into 2 today to share on the webinar. There's a wealth of detail in the report, which we can't possibly do justice to in a webinar, so please go to the report itself for more detail. But I will go fairly rapidly through some of the highlights, and we can obviously dig into more detail on specific topics in the chat. So the 2 topics are the landscape of advisory support, what does it look like, and what lessons have we learned. So I will move straight on into the first section to look at the what, the why, the who, the tools, and the trends. What are we talking about? It's surprising how long it took to actually define this precisely in writing the report. We're focusing on the non-financial support. Normally it's advice. Some people call it technical assistance. It can be training, mentoring, in-kind support. It's anything that's non-financial. Sometimes it's provided to enterprises, sometimes entrepreneurs, sometimes innovators. Each provider has a different definition, but broadly, entrepreneurial beings that are trying to deliver development impact commercially. Sometimes it's with finance and sometimes it's standalone. So providers are quite different in whether they combine the two or not. We asked all the providers, why? Why do you do it? And there was a lot of consensus on this. Originally, when people started investing in BOP enterprises or social enterprises, inclusive business, the focus was on finance. The recognition now is that enterprises are not going to scale with just finance, or they're not going to scale quickly enough. So the reasons for providing technical support or advisory support is that finance isn't enough, success rates need to be increased, and the pace of success needs to be increased. Now, what do you think about the landscape? I have 4 statements on the screen for you here. I'd like you to look at the 4 and vote for which ones you think are true. And we will be touching on these in the next few slides. Click on the ones you think are true. Ten more seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. I'm slowing down because I can see people are still voting. 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2. Any last votes? Okay, let's see the results from you. So broadly, you think the first and the last are true, but only just, and the second 2 not. Okay, let's go through some findings and see where we got to. In terms of who provides support, we group them into 5 different types. There is no easy and fully agreed definition, but incubators and accelerators I think are fairly obvious. Programs and facilities tend to be donor funded or foundation funded. It's a wealth of different programs out there that are focusing on these kind of enterprises and tend to include advisory support. Impact investors clearly provide finance, but many provide technical support or advisory support alongside. And consultancies and specialized organizations are a real mixture, often commercial, but often not just commercial. One of the differences between these groups is the type of enterprise they focus on in terms of maturity stage. So we've mapped that along the top. The incubators tend to be, not surprisingly, at the very earliest stage. The accelerators also, but often sometimes further on. The programs and facilities really can cover anywhere in this spectrum. Impact investors are clearly those that are post-revenue and moving up into scale. And the consultancies, again, tend to be later on. Very broad rules are there to be broken. That's roughly how we see the landscape. Secondly, what kind of tools are most used? There's a huge diversity of tools provided. We've divided it into the 4 primary tools, which are one-to-one support. An expert engages with a business, tends to be on site for a specified challenge, specified period of time. And face-to-face support in cohorts tends to be an event, a few days, a gathering, training, perhaps some visits. Then there's online-based supports, MOOCs, these massive online open courses. And the 4th category is interesting because people don't often define it as a category, but we saw it emerging a lot, which is referrals and brokering linkages, often linked up to the other tools. And then there's a range of secondary tools that are also provided that you can see on your screen. Now, how do these tools vary also by stage? On the whole, and again, generalizations are dangerous, the face-to-face cohort events and the online courses tend to be used more by the earlier stage enterprises, and the one-to-one support more by the more mature enterprises. The referrals and linkages is across the piece. Now, there are 2 reasons for this. One is that early stage enterprises are more likely to have similar needs. The real basics of doing a business plan, getting accounts in place, getting HR sorted. All startups, all early stage enterprises need that. So it's easier to cover common topics in a cohort event or an online course. The more mature businesses have very different needs, whether it's something technical, a recipe, an engineering element, a marketing element, whatever it is, it's more likely to be specific to them. So they're more likely to need one-to-one support. The other reason is the earlier stage enterprises are more risky, and few providers will invest the amount of money it takes for one-to-one support in something that's so risky. The risk is much less later on. So what trends do we see in the landscape of provision? Broadly, it's a very fragmented, evolving space, and evolving fast. There is consensus that advisory support is needed, but it's not easy. We've seen a mushrooming, an explosion of the number of providers and the diversity of offers. And what we really notice most of all is that each provider is pushing boundaries, they're piloting, they're testing, they're going beyond what they thought they would do and normally do and learning lessons. But the ecosystem as a whole is only just beginning to consolidate and share lessons, more so in the accelerator space than in the other spaces. So this report is one step along the way in having the ecosystem to consolidate some lessons. Finally, what topics are covered? What do people actually give or receive advisory support on? Again, there is no way of defining this. We've built our analysis on Andy's grouping of topics, ranging from the very internally facing BDS accounts and human resources, BDS being business development services, other aspects of core business development services, marketing, distribution. There's a number that focus on investment facilitation, finding matchmakers, doing matchmaking with investors. And then there are some that are focusing more on the ecosystem and partnerships in the ecosystem, and some that are focusing not on the core business, commercial success, but on strengthening the inclusive or the innovative nature. For example, let's take IDEO, which is all about human-centered design. Or we recently published the report of the Technical Assistance Facility offering TA in Southern Africa, which was about strengthening the inclusive business model of some corporates. So those are ones that aren't focusing on the nuts and bolts of the core business, but on the innovative or inclusive element. So let's recap our poll. You guys were pretty right. I think if I remember, the poll said, the majority said yes to 1 and 4. Firstly, is it mainly incubators and accelerators? Well, Gally says there are hundreds of incubators and accelerators even founded just since 2011. I think they are the majority. There are scores, probably well into the hundreds, of programs, facilities, funds that include some element of advisory support, but they're probably still outweighed by the incubators and accelerators. There aren't so many impact investors doing TA that we know of, technical assistance as they tend to call it, not so many consultancies. Impact investors, no, they definitely do not only provide finance. There are a growing number that do provide advisory support. Grassroots Business Fund, Acumen, or Midyar have been doing it for a long time, but others are definitely doing it now. Advisory support is probably most commonly provided to and used by early stage businesses, but there are clear examples where it is useful for the larger, more mature companies. The companies that have got impact investment or DFI investment, they still get advisory support, and the consensus seems to be that they need it. So we shouldn't assume it's only useful at the early stage end. And then finally, yes, we think these are the two main tools. So moving on to what lessons have been learned about making it effective. And we'll focus this mainly on those two main tools, but also look across the landscape as a whole at any common lessons that have emerged. Right, last chance to share your opinion, at least before we get to the Q&A. You've got 4 statements in front of you. Would you like to click which ones you think are true? Four statements, choose which ones you think are true. Okay, let's have the countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Any last votes from the last 20 odd people who haven't voted? Okay, we'll close the poll and see what you said. So not many think the first or third are true, and most of you think, more than 2/3 think the second and fourth are true. Pretty good. Let's see what the report says. So first of all, we did definitely find that providers are adapting because they are learning what works. So although there's very little written until today, of course, about what works and what doesn't, with the exception of Galley, which I will come back to in a second, there's little documented about what works, but there is certainly a lot of learning going on, even though this space is quite young. So on the first poll item, you guys were right. Some of the adaptation we're seeing is the cohort events becoming shorter, but the engagement becoming longer. Training methods being more applied, less classroom, less formal. A number of providers are blending tools in combination. Most of them are adding in ecosystem signposting, and some of them are actually developing the capacity of local providers for on-site expertise. Just give you one example. A Unisocial business has shifted to shorter events, less heavy events, and a longer term relationship in which the cohort event is part of a longer relationship. Similar example is Saving Lives at Birth, which is funded by USAID, which has a very intensive event with lots of ecosystem signposting, but it's within an 8-month engagement. So there you can see this blending of events and shifting of tools. So what are the pros and cons of different tools, and what have we heard from providers about success factors? I won't go into all of the details here, and we'll only look at 2 tools. The report itself looks at several different tools. But in terms of the one-to-one support, this is expert technical support provided by an, quote, expert, usually on site, but often including remote support to the business. And the main advantage, as we already said, is that it's tailor-made to the client needs. It can deal with a very specific issue, tends to be a good fit for the more mature business. And the challenge is it's pretty intensive and costly. And also, if you get the relationship wrong or the provider wrong, it's a waste of time because it takes an awful lot of effort. From the provider point of view, it's not very scalable. So some of the success factors are really around that careful selection of the expert. And we did hear of success and failure with different types of experts. There's no rule as to whether they need to be local or national. What we really did here, though, is they need to fit, have a cultural fit, and understand the local context. So there are probably more risks with the international ones, but then there's a risk that the local experts might not be able to tap into the wider international expertise if it's a particularly technical issue. But certainly there's a push to develop more local expertise. And the nature of the relationship and the long-term engagement is a success factor. Let's look at the cohort events. These can be anything from a couple of days to a couple of weeks. The benefits are, one of the strongest benefits raised by attendees is the peer learning, where we have seen feedback from people who attended these, and we haven't seen a lot of it because most of it isn't published. The peer learning and the peer networking comes out very strongly. The costs are relatively low, and it's pretty easy to cover the basics in quite an effective way. Obviously, the disadvantage is it's less tailored to particular needs, and the entrepreneur has to leave their business for several days, which can be really tough. The success factors here seem to be about having some kind of common denominator between the participants. It might be the sector they're in, such as all being in health. It might be the stage. It might be the issue they are dealing with, such as government or pricing. But there needs to be some common factor. And then the other factors are around the planning and the design of the actual event. Finally, on the success factors, across the piece, we identified 5 operational issues that need to be addressed for it to be effective. They don't have to be addressed in the same way, i.e. we're not saying there's the same answer for everybody, but these issues do need to be addressed. The first one is the outreach and selection of enterprises. Some providers have to actually advertise, outreach, and find their participants. And actually, going back to the poll, the report flags up that this is an area for investment and attention. It's easy to get lots of applicants. It's not easy to get the right applicants who really need the support that that provider provides. People might apply just because it's some kind of help rather than it's the right help. Other providers already have their portfolio of investees and grantees, and they have to decide how to allocate support. Does everyone get the same or the same percentage of their finance, or is it based according to need, and different providers use different rules? The second issue that needs to be dealt with is the assessment of needs, and the report flags this as one of the biggest issues of all, understanding needs. Some use tools and some do it through close interaction. Whenever the need is assessed, it needs to be responded to quickly, because I think we all know that business needs change quickly. Thirdly, as we've already discussed, is the selection of the right service provider. Fourthly, there's a whole question about pricing. There are concerns that if it is unpriced, the provision of support itself is unsustainable or at least unscalable. On the other hand, enterprises need advisory support as they're growing, and often they cannot afford to pay for it. So there are also concerns that if the enterprise isn't paying, they might not have skin in the game, they might not have buy-in, they might not make enough use of it. So we found different examples of this. I think the consensus that we got is twofold. One is that enterprise buy-in is essential. It doesn't have to be paying, but buy-in, commitment, leadership commitment has to be there. Secondly, financing, rather than the enterprise paying, financing a provision is essential. It could be done through subsidy, it could be done by the enterprise, or it could be done through deferred payment mechanisms, such as no win, no fee, win fee systems. And there are innovations happening in that space. And finally, another really important issue flagged is the whole need for monitoring and feedback and using that feedback to improve design. And we really did hear examples where some tools had been shut down and some providers had stopped their contracts with the outsourced consultants who were providing it, and design and provision had really been changed in response to feedback. Not sure we heard that enough, but we did hear how useful feedback was when really gathered. So, the poll. Did you get it right? I think you did pretty much. The first and the third you disagreed with, and so does the report. There are plenty of lessons, and on the third one, it's not about the right international expert, it's about the right expert. And on the second and fourth, yes, investment in outreach and selection is needed, and technical support, it's important for the enterprise to buy in, but not necessarily pay. So finally, what evidence did we find of the actual value or cost effectiveness of advisory support? Well, I'm sorry to say it's not conclusive. It's actually impossible to assess the counterfactual. The business grew after it had advisory support or while it had advisory support, but so what? What would have happened without that? It's very, very difficult counterfactual. We tend to have immediate feedback, and what we've seen is quite positive, usually, but it's mixed and often not published. And then we have the long-term results, which is what GALI, the Global Accelerator Learning Initiative, tracks: profit, revenue, capacity to attract investment in the year and the following years after acceleration. But again, there are many confounding factors that would affect that, not just advisory support. There's very little data on how businesses actually use the advisory support, and without knowing that, it's hard to make an assessment. I would refer you to GALI's unique data set. It's on accelerators and incubators only, and what has emerged so far is definitely positive, comparing those that have used acceleration with those that applied and did not use it. But of course, it doesn't prove the case because of other confounding factors. I think most significantly, we're seeing investors and grantors voting with their wallet. They're allocating more of their funds to advisory support, and entrepreneurs are voting with their feet. They're signing up for it. So for now, that's the other part of the evidence case. So in conclusion, what are the implications? We've divided these into the implications for entrepreneurs and providers. For entrepreneurs, it's about being choosy and really investing in this, working with the provider, assessing needs, selecting the provider. Those seem to be the top tips for making it successful for you. Don't just go headlong into it, into any kind of advisory support. And for the providers, well, there are several tips, but key ones are about understanding needs, being responsive, and understanding how what you offer fits into what else the client has. And most of all, don't assume your effectiveness, but get feedback on it. And then there are some implications for the sector as a whole, where there is potential for a lot more collaboration and building this as an ecosystem, not building any specific advisory support provider or enterprise, but building the ecosystem of support. There's a need for more enterprise feedback in scale and depth, and there's a lot of scope for testing and sharing what works, what's the value, what are the impacts, how can we improve or assure quality, how can financing and pricing be developed further to build a sustainable system, and is there any way to make the high-touch support more affordable, scalable, and replicable while still maintaining that high value? That skimmed over the surface of a lot of findings in a rich report, so I urge you to look at the full report. You have the link here and again on the webinar page and at the end of this presentation. But for now, I'm going to hand back to our facilitator.
Hello, everyone. This is Aline Menden. Thanks, Caroline, for your presentation. And let me introduce myself. I'm an entrepreneur myself, having co-founded Endeavor, which is a company of experts on inclusive business, doing research and consultancy on the topic. After this very rich presentation, and thanks again, Caroline, for your really valuable insights, I have now the pleasure to introduce you to our two panelists, Claire Reid and Kevin Hayes, and facilitate the discussion with them. So while you two switch on your webcams, let me say a few words about them. And since we have such a poor gender balance on this webinar today, I'd say gentlemen first. Kevin Hayes is an acceleration facilitator for securing water for food, which is obviously a TA facility. It funds and accelerates technology-based solutions that enable more food to be produced with less water. Kevin's role is to recruit and manage a global network of consultancies and experts to provide technical assistance to the innovators of the program. And Claire Reid is a South African entrepreneur. More concretely, she's the CEO and brilliant mind behind Real Gardening, which is a social enterprise that sells paper seed strip technology, which enables anybody to grow their own food. I would now like to kickstart the discussion by asking Claire and Kevin a couple of questions. And then in about 10 minutes, we will open the floor for your questions. So while the panelists speak, please already think of any questions you may have for them or for Caroline or previous speakers, and type them into the chat. Since we have learned a lot about TA providers already, I'd like to start with Claire to hear the entrepreneur's perspective. So hi Claire, if you could unmute your microphone, and could you please introduce yourself and Real Gardening briefly, and also tell us what type of support have you been receiving and with what result?
Hi, thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Perfect. So Real Gardening is a product I developed when I was 16 years old in response to the direct problem I faced when trying to plant vegetables at home to sell to my parents for additional pocket money. I was overwhelmed by the whole experience of what seed to choose, where to plant it, how far apart, where to water. And then when the stuff started to grow, I didn't even know what was what I planted and what was a weed. And the entire exercise overwhelmed me, and I wasn't very successful at it. I then decided to develop a way that would enable me and anyone else that was having similar issues to me to plant vegetables correctly. So Real Gardening encases natural, top quality, non-GMO seed with the nutrients specific for that seed in a biodegradable paper tape at the correct distance apart. And then it's color coded. So you would plant the strip vertically like this in the soil. So you just see the colored strip above the soil. And then wherever there's a break in color, that's where the plants will come up. So you know exactly where to water. It saves up to 80% in water consumption during the germination phase. And you know exactly where to weed. If something is growing elsewhere and not out of the piece of paper, then you know that that's a weed and you can take it out immediately. We sell it in what we call gardens in a box. So it's a pre-packed mix according to the area and the month of planting. And we do that right from a 1 square meter size garden all the way up to a 200 square meter size garden. So yeah, that's what Real Gardening does. We have been fortunate. We have been fortunate enough to be a Securing Water for Food awardee from the first year of the award. And through the Securing Water for Food program, we've been able to grow extensively as a social enterprise. Securing Water for Food has understood the need that we need to grow as a business to be able to sustain ourselves and to continue doing the good work that we do within the base of the pyramid market, but in a way in which our business will be self-reliant on ourselves, so that once the Securing Water for Food grant comes to an end, we're able to continue doing the work that we want to in the areas that need it the most, but without the need for additional grants. And that's really where the technical assistance facility has been key for us to be able to understand how to do that as a small business.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Claire. And since we heard from the first poll that we have other entrepreneurs on this webinar seeking advisory support, you, as an experienced receiver, what would you recommend them?
I think what I wish I learned earlier on in the experience was to trust the technical assistance facility to tell me what I needed. And it's quite, it's a difficult spot for an entrepreneur to be in. I went into the process with my own view of what I needed from the technical assistance facility for me to grow my business. And we started down that route for the first 6 months. And even though that support was being given to me because that's what I was requesting, the technical assistance facility, specifically Kaizen, who have been phenomenal, were starting to direct me and tell me, well, we feel that you need to step back and you need to start understanding your customer more. You need to start understanding your value proposition. You need to start creating a more robust financial plan and financial strategy and forecasting. And it's things that I didn't think that I needed. But actually, when we started the process, it was at that point that I realized I needed that more than the things that I had previously asked the technical assistance facility for. So I think I wished I hadn't wasted that first 6 months asking them for what I thought I needed. I should rather have trusted in the process from the beginning, because they really are experts in this field, and they're experts at being able to decipher where the gaps are that you need to be able to fill as a small business.
Thank you. And since we heard that the majority on this call are actually TA providers, what would be your key advice to those providing support from an entrepreneur's perspective?
I think my key advice would be that the support needs to be provided by someone that actually understands what it is like to work on the ground in the areas in which the entrepreneur is. It wasn't very useful for us working with consultants based in the United States who had a very different expectation of the real life issues we were facing on the ground in South Africa. But when we started to work with service providers that were based in India, that had a far better experience of what it is like to actually run a small business and work within the areas of need that we work in a third world country, it really did make a big difference to be able to work with someone that understood what it was like for us on the ground.
Thank you. And Kevin, now over to you. Now that we've heard such great things about securing water for food, I think everybody's curious to hear about the type of support you provide. Can you tell us a bit more?
Sure, absolutely. So we provide a wide-ranging array of support. So actually our support covers about 21 different categories, and it covers anywhere from business development to business mentorship, business modeling, website development, legal services, sales and marketing, a wide variety. Some of this support is actually directly provided to the innovators themselves. Others support types are more for the TA facility and how we run, for example, events when we're on site at a conference, something like that. Over time, we've added some categories. So, for example, we've added some gender-focused support, both based on the interests of our founding partners, as well as what was being demanded by our innovators. So, for example, the gender-focused support came about because innovators were saying, hey, we're not getting support or advisory that's anything more than kind of high-level strategy that we can't necessarily tie directly to tangible action plans on the ground. So we addressed that need and provided more tangible, this is how you should be considering a gender-focused in your business model or in your sales approaches, for example. So that's an area that we've added over time based on demand from our innovators. I would say the most demanded support and the support areas that we've provided most frequently are in the business model development, and in some cases that's representative because or reflective of the types of early stage innovators that we've brought in. And then usually once they've been in the program for a year or two, then we start providing more in the sales and marketing strategy space. So those are two of the top demanded support types. We've also get a lot of requests for connections to potential investors and funding organizations. And we've tried a couple of different ways to deliver that. Some have worked better than others.
Thank you. Yeah, you've already alluded to my next question on how your support actually evolves over time. I'd like to touch upon a particular aspect we heard from Claire. She mentioned entrepreneurs have a specific idea on the support needs at the start, but that for an advisor, it's not always helpful to be only guided by those needs, right? So I was wondering, how do you strike the balance between making sure the support meets the needs of the entrepreneurs, and how do you then bring your own, or make sure you also bring in your own experience and what you know works best?
Exactly. So yeah, that's a very good question. And at first, we provided that support and we understood their needs in a very different way than we do now. So at first, it was basically just through a conversation with the innovator. So in our first year, we had acceleration support planning calls with each one of our innovators. And that was really kind of a blank slate conversation. So, we weren't trying to impose our views per se, but we were trying to be a very much demand-driven organization. You tell us what you believe you need, and we will do our best to deliver. And as Claire was referring to, we've basically changed that philosophy over time. So we we drafted a diagnostic called the Innovator Needs Diagnostic that helps us more systematically uncover or highlight the gaps that need to be addressed. So some of those barriers to scale that we see. That diagnostic is loosely based on the components of the business model canvas, if people are familiar with that, with that tool. That helps us get a sense of how well the innovator knows their customer, what sort of engagement do they have with them on a regular basis, getting feedback from them, do they understand the value proposition from the customer's perspective, not just from the innovator's perspective. So that tool has been very helpful to help us to be a value-added advisor to our innovators. It gives us much more of a systematic way to highlight the needs and put together an acceleration support plan for the coming year. We also get feedback from the support providers that are working with the innovators. So they have, in many cases, spent up to 6 months working with our innovators on a very intimate basis, and can come away with some highlights and some learnings that we may not be able to get. So I'm in regular contact with the support providers, trying to understand what are they learning, what are they seeing as what would help this innovator as the next phase in the support that's delivered. And then we also conduct quarterly calls with each of our innovators. So on a regular basis, we are having conversations with them to understand, how is your business changing? What are some of the successes you've experienced in the previous 3 months? What are some of the new challenges you're facing? And then revisit the planned support for that year based on what we're hearing there. So in some cases, we have actually diverted the support to a different area based on what we're hearing from our clients. So those are some of the ways that we're keeping up with changing needs of our innovators.
Fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing this in such a detailed way. And Kevin, from what we've heard about Claire, this seems to be a success case. And I wanted to also promote the blog post that Claire has written on Practitioner Hub, which actually shows her views on the support that she has received. But Kevin, can you maybe share a case where support was not so effective and your learnings from that?
Right. So I think there's, it's rather than go into a specific case, I can give you kind of characteristics of cases that haven't worked as well. So I would say one is one that Claire alluded to earlier. So in the initial year of the project, we had more international providers in our network. And most of the support was delivered through those international providers. And as Claire mentioned, there are certain support types that really can't be delivered from someone that's not located either within that country context where the innovator is implementing, or maybe don't have a more experienced knowledge of working in a developing country, for example. So I would say there was some cases where the support didn't work out so well, where we were trying to provide what really should have been localized support through more international providers. Another case that I would say is where innovators are really pushing for kind of second order services, second order support, before they have really bedded down the financial components, the foundational components of, for example, their business model or getting a financial model in place. So we've really encouraged our innovators, rather than moving forward with trying to create a sales and marketing strategy, for example, before you've collected some really solid data from your customers, let's take a step back and do that first. So we've had a few cases where we've tried to push forward with that sales and marketing piece, trying to be responsive, but then have had to, once we get into the support engagement, had to step back and revise that support to be more reflective of where the innovator is and their maturity at that stage.
Thank you so much. So I could go on forever to ask you questions. I actually have a list of them, but I think the audience is keen to get their questions out after about 45 minutes of presentations. We've already received some questions previously to this webinar, and I see a lot of questions coming in. And just to announce, I try to cluster them as much as possible. And let me start with the first set of questions. So these are some of the questions which we received beforehand. So Kevin, money or training, how to prioritize between the two to achieve greatest impact was a question that was asked. And another question related to that was, what is the greatest challenge to providing effective advisory support? So the question on effectiveness also of the two and how to combine them.
And the first comparison was money versus training?
Money versus training, and how to prioritize between the two.
Got it. Well, Securing Water for Food is doing a bit of both. So we provide grant funding. However, that grant funding is contingent upon hitting a set of milestone targets year to year. So an innovator does not stay in our program for the full 3 years if they cannot demonstrate progress through hitting their milestone targets. So that's we are providing money through that means. However, we are complementing it with the advisory support. And I think that's very helpful because, in many cases, we're able to kind of target that support to help them achieve their milestone targets. So it's very much of a complementary, the money is there, however, you have to hit the targets that have been set and agreed to. And then we have the advisory support that can help you hit those targets. I think one important learning from our experience is that you don't want to be too focused on hitting those targets through the advisory support, because you don't want to take too much of a short-term lens. You need to be thinking longer term for your business. So it's a bit of a fine line to walk, but we want to be providing that advisory support that can both help them to achieve their targets, but also are setting them up for long-term success and not just hitting a short-term goal.
Thank you. The next question is for Claire. Claire, what type of research and due diligence did you do to select your advisory support? And how did you distinguish that provider from what might have been a crowded field of offerings, is the question.
So I'm very fortunate that the technical assistance facility, and Kevin in particular, did that for me. So how the process has worked, I trust Kevin a lot. And I would work with him to create what we call a scope of work. And once I'm happy that the scope of work will provide exactly what I need, Kevin is great with advising, where additional things need to be put in or where it would fall into an additional scope of work. Then Kevin and his team at Kaizen will put out the scope of work, and then people will bid on that scope of work, and then Kevin narrows it down to who he thinks are the best 2 or 3 candidates. And then I, in some instances, had a Skype call with 2 different companies. And then from that Skype call, I will ascertain who I feel will be a better fit for our small team, specifically around sharing our passions and values and just showing an interest in what we do. We've been fortunate enough now for a while to work with the same provider. We continue to choose the same provider, and they're based in India. They're called Satva. And it really has gotten to a point where Jatin is the man that we mostly work with. He really cares for us as a small business, and he really has gone over and above outside of the hours that are put on paper for a scope of work. My team is on a WhatsApp group with Jatin. He comes up with ideas for us all the time, but to the point where it's wrapping up. Our technical assistance facility support is now wrapping up at the end of this month, really. And Jatin really wants to make sure that we've got everything we need from him as the handover. And he, on his own money, not through his company, not through money he's receiving from the technical assistance facility, he's flying from India to come to South Africa for 2 days next week. He's going to stay in my house with me, and he's going to work with my team for 2 solid days on his own money to make sure that the handover is good, and it's what we need as a small business. And he doesn't want that to be it. He wants to continue working with us, even outside of the system, and not with expectation of us being able to pay him for the work. And I think that shows when you really do have a good fit with this support, it really does become an extension of your team, but to a point where there's a lot of love and support and emotion in a good way. And we just have been really, really fortunate to be able to have that with Sattva. And it really was Kevin and his team who were able to create that link for us.
Yeah, and Claire, just to make sure, how did you find securing water for food in the first place? Maybe you can share 2 sentences on that.
Sure. So I had been working for about 2 years with a business mentor based in Boston, who I had met through another pitching competition that I didn't get very far in the pitching competition, but David, the man based in Boston that runs a scale incubator, if you can call it that, he really just wanted to help me. And I'd been talking with David for about 2 years, backwards and forwards, him helping us to develop our whole model, really. And David was the one that came across the Securing Water for Food Grand Challenge. He made me aware of it. I was very overwhelmed with how to even apply, and I found a lot of the language confusing, and I didn't really know how to correctly answer a lot of the questions. So David really held my hand through that whole process, and I was very fortunate that we got to we're able to become one of the awardees, and that really was because I had a great business mentor in David who was able to guide me through the process.
Perfect, thank you. So Caroline and Kevin, there's a wealth of questions on how actually to finance TA services. Some people are wondering, is it actually a sustainable business model to provide advisory support, which is not grant dependent? And what your thoughts are on for-profit consulting in the inclusive business space. One person also asked, what's the best way to structure fees when offering advisory support, since entrepreneurs might not be able to afford the support when they are asked to pay for it. So maybe Caroline, you go first in sharing some of the models that we have seen in the report or when doing research for the report, and maybe Kevin, you can then chip in with your reflections on the topic.
Sure. I'm actually looking at page 59 of the report that has a whole table of different pricing models used by different organizations, many examples. So do look at page 59 if you really want the detail. Basically, there are some that are applying fairly minimal prices, a contribution for a skin in the game. I see someone estimated that on average accelerators charge 1,300 per enterprise, which is not minimal, but it ranges from 120 to 5,000. That's quite possibly still quite a lot less than the real cost of providing it, although that depends on length and location. I think the interesting work that's going on with DFID is funding some work, looking at an initiative to develop more of a system of subsidizing it at the start and the payment being recouped later as investment flows and the business grows. And I think in the long term, that's what's going to be needed for a sustainable market. Different providers will use different degrees of donor or philanthropic subsidy, but somewhere in the system, some kind of subsidy is needed to at least cover the gap until the business can afford to pay. So I think it's a space that will evolve a lot. Some of the commercial organizations or organizations that you might think are commercial, and some of their clients, they do charge full commercial rates, but they still charge below commercial rates to other organizations or do it on a fee-based share of the deal that comes at the end. So huge range, but I think it'll change fast.
Thank you. And Kevin, any specific insights? If you want me to repeat the questions, just say the word.
Sure. Just a couple of thoughts that I had, and I'll caveat this. This is my opinion. That doesn't necessarily represent the views of SWIFT. So just speaking from my own experience here, but we're certainly a grant provider, and I think there's certainly we have reasons for doing that, and so that's the way we've decided to go. I think, other financially sustainable ways to do that. You might potentially industries might want to do this, where corporations are putting into a fund, or an accelerator incubator is being sponsored by corporations who are looking for the up and coming technologies within that space. Also we've seen corporate accelerators that are using their incubator accelerators to, kind of survey the landscape of new technologies out there that they could use to either, acquire certain technologies that are addressing certain business problems that they're having, or maybe enhance their service offerings to their clients. So, I think there's probably a number of ways that this becomes financially sustainable outside of kind of the grant funding space that we're particularly in. I think I think there was a question in there about the cost effectiveness of some of these stage innovators. It's very difficult for them to afford the one-on-one advisory support. And I think one of the things that we found is that using those local providers can be more value for money, because we're certainly operating on a relatively limited budget of advisory support per innovator, and we're able to leverage that to have a broader impact, because in some cases of the specific providers that we're using. I think, in the case that Claire mentioned, where this has worked best in our experience is when the consultancy kind of has in their mission statement, or in their mission, to help move along social impact startups. So, we've had several cases where innovators, or support providers, are willing to go above and beyond see the success come from what the innovator is providing, and certainly we've had a lot of our support providers who really buy into and believe in the mission statements of our innovators. So there's extra motivation to help them achieve their goals, even beyond what the specific scope of work is saying. So we get it's proven to be very cost-effective support provision from our standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And just before we wrap up the financing cluster of TA, or as advisory support, I know we've discussed this a lot, Caroline, but maybe you can share your views on this. So there are some providers that provide support for free, and as the questions alluded to, there's obviously a lot of organizations that are trying to do this on a commercial basis. So what's your view on the challenge of avoiding market distortion, so to say?
Frustrating that there's a lot out there that is free and might not be of high quality, but people will go for it because they need to go for something that's free rather than based on quality. I think one of the lessons that emerges for entrepreneurs is really focusing on getting what you most need rather than what is most available or lowest priced. But obviously that won't always be true. If we look at what the models of, okay, let's look at a few: Carbon Africa, FSG, Hystra, Dalberg, yourselves, Endeavour, Open Capital Advisors, Intellicap, ADP. Some of these that are at the more commercial end, they're actually using a mixture of models, often using a mixture of fees and donor funding. And I think actually that's probably going to be necessary at the minute, partly for them to be competitive in what you might call a distorted market, and partly because even if the direct cost of the provision is covered by the enterprise now or later, we're saying there's a lot of work to do to assess needs, to get the right enterprises that actually need you, to find the right providers, as Kevin was just saying. So all these overhead costs are actually really high if you're going to do it well. If you're going to charge for it, you've got to do it well, otherwise you'll die. So I'm not surprised we're seeing blended finance even at the more commercial end. And I have a feeling we can't say we're not distorting the market. The whole purpose really is at the minute to distort the market, I think, but it's got to be done in a way that builds scalability in the long run.
Thank you. Kevin, do you want to comment before we move on?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question? Because my internet was failing there for a second, so I missed out on that.
Yeah, I just asked Caroline on the question of market distortion, given the fact that, you know, some TA is provided for free and other providers are in the market providing this type of advisory support. Caroline gave a very comprehensive answer, so not sure if you have a particular comment or want us to move on.
Yeah, I don't think I have a particular comment. I just would say, you know, I probably agree that, you know, you kind of, as with anything, you probably get what you pay for. So there's a lot of free advice out there, but you know, you really need to, you know, one, be getting advice from someone who's a trusted advisor. So I think that relationship that was mentioned earlier in the findings, I think is very important. So, you know, someone who's willing to come in and understand your business and really be in a position or position themselves to give some valid advice rather than, you know, some of the free stuff that's out there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And it's now 5 o'clock. The webinar goes until 5:30, but Claire needs to log off shortly. So I wanted to ask the audience if you have a specific question to her. I haven't seen one in the chat beyond the question that we've already asked. So if you can make sure that you get your questions out in the next 5 minutes, obviously prioritize them. But let's move on the provision of support. Kevin, someone was asking what percentage of the innovators in securing water for food in the portfolio receive advisory support? And also another question was, is this provided by different consultancies?
Right, so that's a very good question. So we've had approximately 35, 37 innovators come through our program, and all of them are receiving some sort of support from us. So not all have taken it up every year of the program, but they've all received support, and I think that's reflective of probably the breadth of some support services that they're offering that we can meet. We've been able to meet a lot of needs. In our network, we've got close to 40 providers. I would say about half of those are now locally based. So after that first year responding to our clients' demands, we really made a push to expand the number of local providers in our support network. So I think it's around 50%, if not a little bit more. The TA facility team itself also provides support, and that's very helpful because we, if you talk about the importance of a relationship, we've built up a relationship with them across the 3 years of their participation in our program. So, you know, that's been, we've been very happy to be able to help them and jump in and help them in that way. But yeah, so when you look at the network of support providers, it's a total of about close to 40 and an even mix between local providers and non-local providers.
Aileen, can I just make a comment on?
Yes, sure.
We've talked about the quality of the provider and the need for them to understand the context, but Kevin just talked about the actual team, the technical assistance team, who also get stuck in. And I forgot, we didn't cover that in this presentation, but it's touched on in the report. It's quite a big issue. The core team, whether it's a donor program or a commercial consultancy or an accelerator, whatever, need to really understand business needs. And then we have a few scathing comments in the report about how they can be run by very well-intentioned people that don't know the front end from the back end of a business. Perhaps it's not put quite like that. And how the skills in the core team are very important for success.
Thanks for that comment, Caroline. And Claire, before you log off, do you want to say a few words? Maybe she's already left already.
Oh, no, I'm still here. I'm still here.
Good.
Sorry, I've just got all of these people around the hotel trying to move me out of the lobby. It wasn't a good plan to be sitting here. So no, there's not. I've seen a question come through from Isaac asking what I think the TA facility could have done better to make the engagement even more helpful. I felt like, because it's been a gradual growth, the first year I felt like that we didn't really gel as much, and it was for a various number of reasons. It was for myself as an entrepreneur not understanding how to actually effectively work with a technical assistance facility and give it the time that's needed, and understanding how to delegate certain tasks to my team, which I've now gracefully learned how to do that. And then I think also from the technical assistance facility side, understanding what the needs were for an entrepreneur working on the ground in South Africa, and especially what the needs were for a small team of only 4 people in an office that were already stretched from a time capacity, what we were actually able to provide from our team. I think but we have been vocal, and there has been a lot of conversations about those prickly areas and hiccups as they've happened, and we really have learned to work better together throughout that. So as it stands now, working with the technical assistance facility, year 3 in securing water for food, I don't feel that there is anything really that I can see that would make the process more effective. I really have felt as an entrepreneur that I've been heard, and the problems that we've had in year 1 and year 2 have really been adjusted. And this year 3 has been an amazing, fluid journey where we really have seen immense value. So there's nothing I could change now, but I think if I'm not talking about Kaizen and the securing water for food technical assistance facility, then I think probably other technical assistance facilities may need to focus more on what realistically can an entrepreneur spend time-wise, how much can a small team give, not to the detriment of their business, and how, what is the environment that they're working in on the ground, and enabling them, giving them realistic advice, advice that is dependent on actually the resources and the services we have available to us in our specific areas. I hope that answers the question.
I'm sure it does. And thank you so much for joining us while traveling. That's the entrepreneurial spirit.
Thank you.
So I would like to move to the next cluster that I see emerging in the questions. It's about the effectiveness of support. So let me read the 3 questions I think fall into that. And then Caroline and Kevin, it's questions directed towards you. So the first one is, what do you think are the most effective and sustainable methods of delivering technical assistance to rural businesses that don't result in reliance on the technical support? Maybe Kevin, you can answer that. And then 2 questions, how do you measure impact of advisory services to beneficiaries? I think, Caroline, you touched upon that in your presentation. And for Kevin, what metrics would be used to assess whether an accelerator is actually successful? So I don't know who wants to go first, but feel free to just speak up.
Caroline, would you like to start?
Sure. I'll leave you to comment on the avoiding reliance and focus on the measurement.
Sure.
I think we saw organizations trying to look at effectiveness in very, very different ways. Mainly at the most immediate end of the chain, immediate feedback. And there were quite a lot of good initiatives in this where people have really developed. A few organizations, several did immediate feedback, because, for example, at the end of a cohort event, was it useful? Which sessions were useful? Why was it useful? And some organizations, I have to say, particularly some of the USAID funds, and we looked at a few, and I'm not just saying that because this was a partnership with USAID, they were very good on the feedback side, but as were some others. Some of them could have comparisons of which sessions were useful to early stage or late stage enterprises, or how it changed year by year, what different cohorts needed according to the stage of the enterprise. So you can get a lot out of immediate feedback. Okay, it doesn't really tell you effectiveness in improving the enterprise, but it definitely tells you something for improving design. We saw very little on monitoring how the advice was actually used, adopted. Did it change practice? I find that a really surprising gap, because it's a very obvious thing to measure. 6 months later, 1 year later, was it used? Because as you get further down the, what I think of as a results chain, from the use of the support or the advice to the actual change in the business, you can't take account of other variables. So I think there's more can be done on that. And then, as we mentioned, Galley, which has now got, I don't remember the exact number, but a lot of accelerators and incubators inputting data. That data is about, you know, growth rates, profit, investment raised, and obviously long term, those are the indicators that the accelerator or provider is looking for: higher growth, generally more investment raised. But they have to be taken with a pinch of salt because of all the other factors that affected them. But I think they still have to be tracked. And if you don't feel and see those indicators going up, probably something isn't working.
Thank you, Caroline. Kevin, do you want to tackle the question that we have left for you on the reliance on the technical support?
Sure. So if we're talking about effective methods of delivery assistance that helps to encourage self-reliance, I suppose, and not dependence on the support. You know, I think we found a couple of things. We've tried several different means to provide support. One has been through workshops where all our innovators are gathering for, you know, this associated with a convention, for example, and those did not work out so well. Kind of the you know, bringing all the cohort together to in more of a kind of a structured classroom type setting. That did not work very well. What we found worked well and what was demanded in that type of setting was more around, you know, letting the innovators share lessons learned with one another. So they've got a lot to teach one another, and we just really needed to be providing the platform to where they could share things and their learnings about in areas where they kind of had broad resonance. So whether it be in business development or navigating regulatory environments, something like that, rather than kind of a classroom style, we enabled the innovators to share with one another and pose questions to one another and share their own learnings and expertise. That came with its own credibility because they're all in the same boat and they're working together. So, you know, just to mention that I think that had been an effective means of delivery of helping our innovators learn about specific areas. And, you know, we found, you know, we offer a lot of one-on-one support. And you know, I think the one-on-one support is very valuable. However, there's some characteristics of it that seem to make it more successful than support delivered, you know, without these types of characteristics. And what I would say when I talk about characteristics, I'm talking about you know, one of the things that we noticed that separated a successful one-on-one engagement versus a non-successful one-on-one engagement started out at the very beginning with expectation setting. So we have a work plan template that the support provider completes after an initial requirements gathering conversation with the innovator that really serves as the blueprint as far as how that engagement will go and what will be delivered. The innovator signs up to it and the support provider signs up to it. Mm-hmm. And we as a TA facility also sign up to it. And one aspect of my role is helping to drive down to specificity within that work plan. So the more specific you can get on the deliverable, the more likely the success. Another thing that really helped is what Claire referred to, which is we now give the innovator the opportunity to interview the top 2 vendors that are responding to a call order. So we go through a vendor selection process that's pretty extensive to narrow down from, you know, anywhere from 5 to 10 applicants to work with this innovator to the top 2. And then the innovator has a chance to speak to those top 2. And that's where they can really get a sense of, one, does that provider bring the expertise that we need? 2, do they have the experience that we need? And then 3, how are they to work with? So that's a big driver of you know, whether that support is going to be valuable in the short term as well as in the long term. And then finally, I would say one thing that's helped to increase the success rate of these one-on-one support advisories is that I am in regular contact with both the provider and the innovator, so can raise red flags early in the engagement and get them addressed early, so that we're not getting to the end of an engagement and then learning that there was a misunderstanding of expectations or so forth. We can, because of the regular engagement that the TA facility is having with both the innovator and the support provider, we're able to make sure we're on the same page all the way through the length of the engagement, and not getting to the end and then finding out that the support didn't meet the needs when it was something that we could have addressed very early on in the project.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Actually, you remind me, can I add one point going back on the question of how to monitor effectiveness, which you were just touching on, Kevin? Triangulating what the enterprise is saying and what the service provider or the technical assistance provider is saying is also really important. It's not just about feedback from the enterprise. I really agree with you there.
Any further comments on the questions before I move on? Perfect. There was a cluster emerging actually in the questions that were pre-submitted, which I found quite interesting. It was about learning in the space. So I'm going to read out the 3 questions that we received. With seemingly too many disparate programs, funds, and events, how can we ensure a greater continuity and coordination of support? And how to ensure learning in the space. Another question is, are there forums for sharing lessons learned amongst TA providers? Or is this perhaps a result of this report? So maybe Caroline, you go first again on commenting on this, and I'd like to hear Kevin's views as well.
Sure, I think in a minute we're going to hear from Amy from USAID, and I think that will also help answer this, because one of the reasons this report was commissioned and was done this way by speaking to lots of providers was exactly because of what the questioner is saying. Aside from the GALI initiative, which is pooling a few indicators on high-level data, so it's a very different type. Aside from that, there's not that much sharing. And yet we found there was loads to share, which is why the report ended up twice as long as it was supposed to be, and took twice as long as well. So the report has definitely shown the need for learning and exchange. So I'm looking forward to Amy's comments in a second on USAID's view on taking that forward. I think there are also other ecosystem builders who are interested in this question. Andy, the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, I'm not sure if they're online or not, but they're actively looking at this space, particularly in the acceleration incubation stage, but across the space as well. I know our Gideus Foundation is looking at this. So I do think there are ecosystem builders that could be ready to help the rest of us do more exchange and facilitation. And to me, what we found from the report would really justify that.
Yeah. And Caroline, thanks for making me realize that we are actually coming close towards the end. So maybe let me get 2 questions out before we move to this wider topic of learning in the space for Kevin and also for you, Caroline, that touch upon aspects that we've discussed already. But since there were so many questions coming in, I'd like to come back to this cluster. The first one is the financing cluster. So Derek actually asked, considering that accelerators are mainly supported by public or private funding or from corporates, what are some ways that an accelerator can become commercially sustainable? Have you, Kevin, ever thought about this at USAID, or do you have wider views? And Caroline, once again, I mean, you've shared some of the insights before, but are there any prime examples that you could highlight on commercial sustainability of this type of support?
Shall I go first?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So our project is a time-bound project. So we haven't really put a whole lot of thought into what it might happen after this project. It would be more speculation as far as what the possibilities were. So I'm really not in a position to offer much as far as have we done much thinking as far as how this would be sustainable outside of donor-based funding. So I would feel like I'd be going out on a limb to
sure.
start speculating.
It was just if you have any views on this or comments, but.
Right. I think it's there's probably a variety of ways to potentially do it. I think there probably is a market opportunity out there that clearly some of these accelerators and incubators that are more run out of with a venture capitalist mindset, where they're taking an equity stake in the companies that they are providing services to. So that's one model. There's also a potential model for a scalable solution that offers kind of a membership-based business model of providing lessons learned and best practices across startups, and enabling something that provides a platform for innovators and startups to just share ideas and expertise and lessons learned with each other, and start tapping into what are the best practices that startups have employed that others can benefit from. So there may be a business model out there to meet that need in a scalable way, on a, let's say, a membership-based model where the amount of financial commitment is relatively low per innovator. So yeah, just a thought off the top of my head.
Yeah, and Caroline and Kevin, and I don't know if you share my point of view, but maybe we may also ask, does it need to be provided on a commercially sustainable way, or is this actually the space where public money should be put and comes in and is actually very valuable, particularly to foster impact enterprises? So maybe a remark from one of you, whomever wants to comment on this before we move to the next question.
Well, my view is you nailed it there. We don't have the rigorous proof of the contribution that this kind of support makes, but based on what we can see and people are saying so far, it is making a difference, people think, and that's the justification for public subsidy. We can't say how much the value derived exceeds the subsidy, however, and subsidy is always going to be a challenge, is always going to be a question, and isn't necessarily going to be there forever. So I think we do need to look at sustainability of the sector, because we can't assume a grant-based model is fine forever. But I do think the subsidy is justified. Should I just give you a few more examples of the different models?
Yes, of course.
I think one point to make is that it's not commercial sustainability, but sustainability we're going for. And the ratio of the cost to the outcome, I think, is improving, i.e. people are finding ways to either economize on the costs or more efficiently increase the outcome by adding on low-cost elements. Doing some online aspects in advance, or do some group elements in advance, or some online follow-up to one-to-one support. So I think that the ratio of cost to output is actually probably going down, but not that we have any data for it. Mm-hmm. What are the options? The option is the business pays, but as the questioner said, that's not always possible. Although if I look at the list of incubators and accelerators, Hive and Nairobi Garage, an incubator, they charge commercial fees for co-working spaces. Unlimited and Vilgrow have some fully financed. Oh no, sorry, that's by development partners. Startup incubator at Singularity University take an equity stake. That's a way of ultimately getting payment. So it's not unheard of in the incubator accelerator space. Yeah. Growth Africa also a percentage share of investment raised if the business is successful. So it is happening in that space. The second model, as we've said, is the subsidy pays. The third, I think, is some kind of cross-subsidy approach, which, Kevin, I think is what you were getting at, about, you'd have membership fees, you can have the later stage, more commercial provision helping to subsidize the early stage, or you can have online courses, which are really free once you've recovered your costs, charging and covering some of the more intensive. So I think there are more cross-subsidized and hybrid models emerging.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, I have to say, I just noticed that our time is close to being up. So you may have noticed that there's a wealth of questions in the chat that unfortunately we couldn't get to. Because for me, it was hard to strike a balance between the questions that we've already received, the questions that came in, but we are committed to really get the answers to you. So we will cluster the questions and create a follow-up document with some answers that will be shared with attendees along with the recording. And I hope that that leaves you all satisfied. And Amy, I now have the pleasure to hand over to you. Thanks again to Caroline and Kevin for your answers and for providing such deep insights. And Amy, I think we have given you enough food for the concluding remarks, touching upon the learning in the space briefly, and also the value proposition for specifically having public organizations in the space. So we are keen to hear from you about the discussion and views from USAID.
Yeah, great. Thanks everyone for joining today and for all of your good questions. As Eileen mentioned, I'm Amy Stickler, and I work to provide primarily that sort of high-touch, customized acceleration support that Caroline talked about in her presentation. And I do this for several grant programs at USAID. As Alexis mentioned at the start, we really wanted to do this study to get a better sense of what's working and, in some ways, more importantly, what's not working in the acceleration and technical assistance space to help inform our own programming, and as we've learned this, to help hopefully inform others as well. It's been clear to us, and I'm sure many of you for quite a while, that access to finance isn't the only barrier facing businesses in their efforts to grow and scale what they're doing, and it's more and more important that we think about what's next, and especially for donors to be thinking about what else is important besides grant funding in order to ensure that our funding itself is as impactful as possible. It's also important for us, as I mentioned, that as we're sort of collecting these lessons learned and understanding better how to be most impactful in this space, that we're sharing this. And I think that's something that was mentioned in the discussion and something that we'll be thinking about a lot more going forward. This report, I think, taught us a lot and reinforced also some of our pre-existing thoughts about the trends in this space and about what's important. I think there's some important takeaways from the report that are worth reiterating, since it's what we'll be focused on more and more going forward. The first is around focusing on what matters. And I think this is something that, as opposed to focusing on what may be more exciting for a donor or what may be more exciting for a business. Without first understanding and then addressing the issues that are really affecting the core business model and the scalability of a business and their ability to grow, I think long-term sustainability is going to be really challenging, and that's no matter how impactful a business could be. Those boring things, getting the boring things right, and by boring things I mean the financial management systems and the quality control checks and the inventory management, etc. These things, the boring things, which is what that core business support that Caroline talked about and the report talked about, helps to provide. Those are the things that I think really increase the impact of all of our work in the long term. And this can be true for the businesses themselves. So it's something donors haven't always focused on, but I think for businesses, it can be tempting to do the sort of sexier things like designing your next product and thinking about that, as opposed to these kinds of important, boring things. So it's both important, I think, for businesses going forward to make sure they're focused on that, as well as for donors and thinking about the kind of support that you provide. The next is focusing on value added. I think this one is important for us at USAID and other donors, as well as service providers sort of trying to differentiate themselves or businesses looking for support. There's so many players in this space, like Caroline mentioned, and I think being self-aware and focusing on the issues where you can really make a difference as opposed to trying to doing everything is important. For donors, I think that really means focusing and recognizing the fact that we're in a unique position in that we don't need a financial return for the support that we provide. unlike many other providers. And that means we can, and I think should, be focused much more on sort of that long-term capacity building, the much longer timeframes for support, and really focusing more on sustainability for businesses. And for businesses, of course, as Caroline mentioned, as we've talked about a bunch, it means being really selective when thinking about your support providers. I think there were a bunch of questions around how you select support providers, how you think about that. I think recommendations from other businesses are really important. I think asking for examples of previous work, etc. And it's important to really critically evaluate the support offered to you, and to focus on those who are specialized in the area that you especially need support in, and who can really add value to your work. And the last thing is something that was talked about in the discussion, and I think is really important, and that we're going to have to think a little bit more about how to play a useful role in this space, which is learning from each other. More and more people are getting involved in the acceleration space, and none of us should be starting from scratch. I think there are a lot of takeaways outlined in this report about supporting businesses focused on impact. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn from one another if we can figure out a way to coordinate a little better. And I think there are also a lot of useful lessons learned that we can take away from the private sector in developed countries, having done this work for many, many years. And I think that last one's a big one. I think that we can hopefully start utilizing lessons learned from the private sector to work towards much longer term sustainability and much longer term development impacts. So these are a couple of things that we've been thinking about for our work going forward, and that we learned from this report. I think there's a lot in the report that will be helpful for multiple audiences, whether you're a donor thinking about your programming, you're a business thinking about the support that you might need, or service providers thinking about the support you're providing. So a big thank you to Ashley Insight and Indeva for putting this together. We hope that you all will read it, and we hope that this will help ensure that the type of support provided to entrepreneurs and social enterprises can be more impactful going forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Amy. I just put back on my hat as editor of the Practitioner Hub for the very last two things to say. That's the end of the webinar. We do need your feedback. You'll be receiving an email shortly asking for that. These webinars are free, so that's the one thing we ask you for, having discussed pricing so much. And finally, on the Practitioner Hub, you can find the webpage with all the links. This will be on YouTube for any colleagues who haven't watched it and should watch it. So please follow up there for links, and you'll see more in your inbox from us very soon. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining.
And Caroline, if I may make a very small comment, someone asked if there's a database of advisory support that they can look at in the chat. So a bit of self-promotion. The Hub is working on that. And by the end of this year, latest early next year, there'll be a database on the Hub. So stay tuned.
Yeah, Search IB is already live, but it will be a lot better by the end of the year. But you can already look at Search Inclusive Business for a list of practitioners. And if you want to make sure you're on that database as it's updated, contact Aileen, whose email address you can see on the slide there. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks also from my side. Also to the panelists, it was fun. Have a nice evening or afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.